this video, we'll cover a few more rhythmic techniques that the Beatles learned from their cover song repertoire and which would inform their own songs. These include an expressive use of a fluctuating tempo and two new syncopated patterns, the son clave rhythm and the triplet. Then we'll get to some final points about Ringo's early approach to the drum set. The Beatles use a change of tempo, which you'll recall refers to the speed at which pulses occur, in two ways. The more common is to have a song introduced by a tentative section that is followed by a faster tempo for the song proper. Two examples from the cover repertoire are Take Good Care of My Baby and Mr. Moonlight, both of which open with a tempo-free introduction before the drums enter. The former example is a precursor to the intro to Here, There, and Everywhere, and the latter can be heard lurking behind the Mellotron's intro to the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. John's own song from 1963, Bad to Me, can be heard as a precursor to the following year's If I Fell. You'll recall stop time, which we explained as a cessation of most of the instrumental texture for a solo spotlight, while time did not really stop. But on rare occasions, the Beatles actually do stop the clock. Paul opens Clarabella with several vocal phrases in free tempo that are punctuated by single chord stabs by the full band, each chord followed by a pause before the song really begins when the tempo kicks in for the fifth bar of a 12-bar blues. We refer to this effect as a fermata, from the Italian to hold, because we hold time without letting it proceed for such a moment. The Beatles bring this into their own writing at the end of She Loves You, when John and Paul stretch time out with a momentary vocal duet as a foil to the rousing conclusion. John will revisit this effect 5 years later at the end of Happiness is a Warm Gun. I'd like to point out two syncopated patterns heard often in the early Beatles. One is the Afro-Cuban son clave rhythm, heard throughout the Caribbean and therefore referred to as a Latin rhythm, which accents the first beat, the second half of beat 2, and then the fourth beat, like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... It's related to the dotted rhythm pattern, but does not articulate the metrically strong third beat. Compare the dotted rhythm from, say, the hand claps of I'll Get You. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then the son clave pattern again has a bit more swing to it. The son clave pattern has always been a rock standby, as with Bill Black's bass line for Elvis's Hound Dog, a son clave arpeggiation of triads that would lead to Paul McCartney's bass line in Like Dreamers Do. As I'm grabbing my bass to demonstrate, let me say that Bill Black's instrument that he played on Elvis's Hound Dog is a stand-up acoustic upright bass that is today owned by Paul McCartney. So first, the triad arpeggiation involves those pitches, and Bill Black sets that in a son clave pattern for a 12-bar blues. And Paul McCartney takes that son clave triad arpeggiation and alternates it with a dotted rhythm. Those are the pitches for his triad in Like Dreamers Do, which goes like this. McCartney brings the same Latin rhythm to the Beatles' cover of Elvis's version of Ray Charles' I Got a Woman, with George Harrison doubling the bass line on his Gretsch. You'll hear a little bit of ornamentation of the triad arpeggiation, but the son clave pattern will be very apparent. So here's the Beatles' cover of Elvis's version with Bill Black's bass line of Ray Charles, I Got a Woman. 1, 2, 3, 4. Many cover songs feature this rhythm in the bass line. Lonesome Tears in My Eyes, the verses of Rock and Roll Music and Anna among them. But it's heard in Caribbean hand percussion in P.S. I Love You, and Ringo plays it on the snare in the Beatles' own Ask Me Why, giving it a particularly Latin cast. Carl Perkins' Lend Me Your Comb presents a striking chord progression in the son clave rhythm, one that John Lennon borrows for Please Please Me. So Perkins' Lend Me Your Comb, as covered by the Beatles, has the son clave rhythm pattern. And this is how it works out in Please Please Me. Notice the rapid subdivisions of the third and fourth beat, giving it much more of a rocking character than the swinging Lend Me Your Comb. Ask Me Why also includes the other syncopating rhythm I wanted to mention, the triplet, which involves dividing the beat or pair of beats into 3 equal parts in opposition to a regularly recurring division into 2 or 4 equal parts. In Ask Me Why, the triplet is played only in the rhythm guitar in the pre-chorus to emphasize the colorful passing augmented triad, creating tension in both pitch and rhythm. So first let me explain this passing augmented triad. It's a dissonant, unstable sonority that occurs in between that major triad, which is stable, and that major triad, which is stable. In between, you get the augmented triad, which supports the dissonant passing tone in between them. So in Ask Me Why, this is how we hear that triplet emphasizing that augmented triad. The Beatles next wrote triplets into From Me to You for the same purpose, to emphasize a passing augmented triad. But here they're saved for the song's most dramatic point, the retransition from the bridge to the returning verse. And so the effect here, played by George, combines rhythmic, pitch, and formal tension all at once. So the retransition in From Me to You. I think the Beatles got the effect from the Crickets, whose Don't Ever Change, a song covered by the Beatles, opens with triplets on the same passing augmented triad. In the song that brings together all of the Beatles' 1963 hit formulas, I Want to Hold Your Hand, triplets are reserved for the very end, where Paul's bass line, doubled by John's and George's guitars, pulls in the reins with the same pitches, C, E, and D, that had created tension in the bass line earlier in the song in a very different way. Thus far with the drum set, we've addressed the various parts of the kit and their usage in establishing basic underlying patterns and colors. In this segment, we'll examine some of the techniques that set Ringo's playing through 1963 apart from other drummers, and some of the ways in which he begins to give each song its own character, a talent that he develops more and more in the coming years, to the point where many Beatles songs will come to have very distinctive drum parts. We're again fortunate to be joined by Ann Arbor freelancer Billy Harrington at Bottle Rocket Recorders. First, because it sets the foundation, the bass drum is normally pedaled on strong beats with either a straight or a dotted rhythm. So Billy, could you demonstrate both a straight rhythm on the bass drum and a dotted rhythm?
Yeah. 2, 3, 4.
But sometimes in his first months with the Beatles, Ringo adds syncopation to selected phrases by kicking on the second half of the second beat. We hear this in early performances of One After 909, covers of Chuck Berry's I'm Talking About You, and the Crickets' Reminiscing, as well as a few outtakes of I Saw Her Standing There, which song was modeled on the just mentioned Chuck Berry number. Billy, could you play some of the 909 bridge, maybe starting with the bass drum alone and adding the other parts?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right, and Ringo plays that pattern only in the bridge of that song,
Right.
but in some of the early takes, Ringo goes to that pattern early.
Right,
and
yeah.
John freaks.
John freaks. What are you doing? Are you out of your mind?
Yeah, right. Okay. The syncopated part is no longer played on the bass drum, but on the snare in two mid-1963 recordings, All My Loving and Don't Bother Me. In All My Loving, Ringo plays a weak part of all second beats in a syncopated snare drum shuffle. So Billy, could you demonstrate that song's verse pattern?
1, 2, 3, 4.
In Don't Bother Me, exotic overdub hand percussion fills in such syncopated spaces even more. One of the Beatles' early syncopated highlights throws the introduction and retransitions of I Want to Hold Your Hand so off balance, it's hard to know when the song's first structural downbeat will fall. It's a unique effect. Syncopated accents would be a more noticeable part of Ringo's playing in 1965, as when his toms double the rhythm guitar and bass in Ticket to Ride. Ringo will sometimes use the snare for the sort of fills normally performed on tom-toms. This can be heard in the opening of I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You and going into the chorus of Keep Your Hands Off My Baby. The two ravers, Twist and Shout and Long Tall Sally, also have a lot of interesting snare action. Billy, can you play the intro and then go into the first verse of Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You as Ringo performed it for the BBC on July 16th, 1963?
Yeah. I'll try. Here you go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Ringo's approach to tom fills is his signature. These are the flourishes that typically mark ends of phrases or lead the band from one section of a song into the next. They are usually wildest at the ends of bridges, those retransitional moments that provide a frisson-inducing thrill in anticipation of a returning verse. They're often restricted to just the single rack tom, that tom that's mounted on top of the bass drum. But sometimes a burst of colors will involve both the rack and the floor toms, or the snare might be combined with one or more toms. This idea was not new with Ringo, but his tom fills were idiosyncratic. To explain, he called himself a left-handed, right-handed drummer, meaning that he would tend to lead with his left hand, even though the kit was set up for a right-handed player. Billy, can you talk about how this might have made Ringo's cymbal work unusual and demonstrate something of how another drummer might do tom fills and how Ringo's are very different?
Yeah, so especially in the live setting, Ringo will crash and really lay into the cymbals just to ramp up the energy and probably match what else was going on stage and in the seats. So for example, I Saw Her Standing There during the solo. Ringo starts crashing with his left hand, whereas a right-handed drummer usually would kind of handle the cymbals with his right hand. So I'll demonstrate both. So right-handed drummer might do something like this during that song, during the solo. live, Ringo tends to crash with his left hand, which is, I think, a pretty unique characteristic of Ringo. So let's try something like that. 1, 2, 3. And as far as tom fills, Ringo doesn't seem like he really likes to play going from left to right on the toms, descending in pitch. Right-handed players tend to play down the toms, actually going from left to right. And Ringo, if he were to do that, his sticking doesn't quite allow him to easily maneuver around the kit, going from left to right.
Can you show how a right-handed drummer would normally go around the kit, and then how Ringo does it differently?
Yeah. So first I'll play it right-handed lead. Try to play it left-handed lead. We'll see how it works out. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's right-handed lead. Left-hand lead. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a lot harder to move around because, if you're going from left to right, you want to lead with your right hand. It just makes it a lot easier.
It looked like you were stuck in midair.
Right, you have to sort of go underneath, anticipate quite a bit. Your classic rock and roll fill might be something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ringo really never does anything like that. He'll play maybe a rhythm that he likes and put it on another drum, something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Something like that. A good example of that is the She Loves You intro, which is very left-hand dominant, which sounds like this. 1, 2. So that's all left-hand lead on one particular drum that he likes.
Very nice, thank you. Interestingly, tom fills highlight the 3 dynamic A-sides of 1963 and many songs on the Please Please Me album, which was meant to recapture the energy of a live show. But they are seldom heard on the second album with the Beatles, appearing only in short bursts of It Won't Be Long and Not a Second Time. Billy, could you demonstrate how Ringo leads into refrains, and I Want to Hold Your Hand, by going from snare to rack tom to floor tom, and then ending his fills with a crash?
Yeah. And Ringo, in this example, has a very specific sticking to get around being maybe a left-handed drummer on a right-handed kit. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Is that a flam that Ringo plays?
Yeah.
Where he hits 2 hits at almost the same time?
Right, just slightly off. It gives a rounder, kind of a fatter sound, something like this.
Two of the last cover songs recorded by the Beatles in May 1965, Bad Boy and Does He Miss Lizzie, are great examples of the sort of highly energetic tom fills that made the Beatles the top club band in Liverpool and then in Hamburg. The floor tom gets scant but important use. Its strongest early associations may be with Gene Krupa's playing in Benny Goodman's Sing Sing Sing. For the Beatles, Money and the bridge of Hold Me Tight are good examples of beat divisions, both beats and their offbeats, played on the floor tom. And the floor tom also has a triplet division of the beat in the introduction to Kansas City. Billy, could you show Ringo's performance in She Loves You, going from the fills following the pre-chorus into the beat-dividing floor tom in the chorus proper?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
We have yet to examine Ringo's approach to the crash cymbal. Unlike later tracks, such as She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, the early work makes sparing use of the crash, and by crash, we're really referring to any especially loud use of the ride or even the hi-hat, as well as the crash cymbal itself. The harmonica break in Love Me Do is punctuated by a crash in both recordings by Andy White and by Ringo, although Andy White's is louder than Ringo's. The closed hi-hat and the crash played in Please Please Me are too deep in the EMI mixes to make an impression before the coda, where Ringo nails each chord change with a dazzle. Exactly the same approach is heard, and still only very faintly, in the third A side, From Me to You. Billy, can you play the rapid snare subdivisions and the crashes in the last few bars of Please Please Me?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
A crash is only faintly suggested once, 2 minutes into this song's November 1962 B-side, Ask Me Why. From the first album, only in Boys is the crash cymbal noticeable, although Twist and Shout makes liberal use of both crash and ride in live shows. This may suggest that George Martin actively stifled Ringo's work in early recording. From more than 30 songs taped in Hamburg's Star Club in December 1962, we know that Ringo featured the crash on stage in his first months with the Beatles. Billy, can you demonstrate what Ringo played in the guitar break, for instance, of I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You in these rambunctious shows?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, this section is pretty much note for note what Ringo plays in the intro of the song. So it's a lot like what the Beatles will do with a retransition of a piece, and it leaves you hanging in a way in the middle of a song until they get back into that original feel. So that goes something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
beautiful.
something like that.
Isn't that crazy?
Oh my gosh.
That's great.
Yeah.
This idea of Ringo's playing more freely outside the EMI studios is corroborated by the crashes he begins to add to live radio station and concert performances of From Me to You and other numbers, especially marking the retransition from bridge to verse, beginning in April 1963 and continuing through the summer. The fourth single, She Loves You, recorded on the 1st of July 1963, still has no big crashes, although live performances from September onward feature this effect between song sections and in the coda. Only by that October, with the new taping technology uncrated for I Want to Hold Your Hand, is the authority of Ringo's crash cymbal recognized at EMI. Billy, do you have any other favorite aspects of Ringo's pre-1964 drumming that we haven't touched on?
Well, I really just appreciate the way when Ringo enters the band, he has a certain attitude that matches the other three. And I think it's just it's a certain confidence, and you can tell the other three Beatles are always saying, Ringo was the drummer, he just didn't enter into the picture until that point in time. And also, Ringo just has this feel with a little bit of swing, I think, in everything. And whether that's listening to maybe American country records or R&B records, that's certainly, both those genres certainly have that kind of feel. It's just a very American thing, in my opinion, to have this swinging influence.
We do know that he was very attracted to Texas and Western sounds, and I wonder if swing and country, Texas swing, might have been part of his listening, part of what he brought to the Beatles.
I would think so. It's just, that combination of being a real, a decently well-known drummer at the time in the area, and having that feel, that combo together, it just makes it, really, really special. And I think that's what made the Beatles, finally click.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bill.
All right, thank you.
In this last look at rhythm in pre-1964 Beatles, we've covered a few tempo changes, such as with the slow introduction and the fermata, a few new rhythms, such as the Latin son clave and triplets, and further topics in Ringo's early approach to the drum set. In later chapters, we'll address Ringo's use of a larger kit and some of the band's original approaches to tempo, rhythm, and meter.